Thank you for the floor, Mr. Speaker. We live today in a world where we have a problem that we cannot fight the numbers of terrorist organizations that are rising. We cannot finish off the wars who have started decades ago because of the terrorist organization, because of people who are so much radicalized that they just cannot accept that there are new things happening in today's society. So we are in a situation where we have asymmetric wars, where we have participants in wars who are not members of who are not accepting the international laws, who are not accepting the international treaties, whose only goal is to make as much damage and as much killing as they can, who don't apply any of those conventions on others, who is one of the jokers is, we can do whatever we want, they cannot do because we have God or someone else on our side, because we are so much rightful that no human law applies to us. The only way that we can actually fight is actually to fight them with their own weapon, because we have already sorted out everything and it haven't given us a result. Furthermore, I want to point out that USA is pretty much only military who can actually fight their terrorist organizations right now with certain level of success, and they're already using this kind of warfare. So a little bit of the framing. We don't say that every terrorist in every time squad is going to be tortured. This is the thing that are going to use only when there is life and death matter. When you have the squad of units who are literally surrounded, when you have the situation of the hostages taken who are actually having the massive problems. So whenever we can get suitable information who is going to help us, the meaningful information who can help us to reach the higher goal, we believe that this is justified. Furthermore, the more people are dying when we are not using these kind of techniques. There are people who are civilians, there are people who have done nothing harm to anyone, and yes, these people who is using these kind of weapons is actually fighting, so we believe that it is on our side to do this. So we don't, so I'm going to start now with my case. So first, who are these people actually? These are people who are members of the organizations like the ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, etc., etc. So these organizations' only goal is to destroy everything which is not like to them. Their goal is to set up the imperative that only their way of life is the only way of life where everyone else can live. No other people who don't share their beliefs cannot actually live under this in the same world as them. Furthermore, they fight against everyone. They fight against children, they fight old. Like take an example, Boko Haram kidnapped like more than 100 girls who are pretty much either sold, either working as sex slaves. You have ISIS who have surrounded Yazidis on that mountain, who are literally starving them to them one by one because they say they're the deed of the devil. So we have the persons who care about nothing except killing the people and making as much as damage as they can. So as I already mentioned, one of the major jokers they have is, we can do this and nobody except us can do this, and therefore we are already having massive power, and we're going to use their way of fighting against us. We believe that we have every legitimacy to fight against these people. So how does this legitimacy actually comes to us? First, as I already mentioned, okay, before that, go.
Boko Haram has released most of the girls they captured because of diplomatic efforts by the Nigerian government. Why did you get that on your side?
So they let a few girls out, but vast majority of the people they are actually having is still under that threat. Also, they have killed same that leader who have let that girl, and now they have even the worst guy on the top of it. So just because some of those leaders have even taken into account working with the international community got killed by his own people. These people are so much brainwashed that they kill even their own leaders because they want to work with other society. So anyone else who wants to come to his place need to be as much as aggressive as they want to, because this is the only way they can fuel their membership, morality, etc., etc. So, but why this is legit? So, as I already explained who are these people and why they are not obliging the laws, etc., etc. They are literally fighting against literally everything. So their targets are like literally the civilians who should be afraid and gone to other side, like change everything, etc., etc. So in the moment when we have these organizations who are fighting against children, against women, against everything, so we literally have the moral obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. So these people have done nothing harm, they don't bring weapons, they don't need anything, they just live their lives. So in a situation where we have organizations who want to kill those people just because they are not sharing their opinion, we have the obligation of this international society to give to the people who are fighting them every possible weapon on disposal. We want all those who can actually have all those people. We want to catch all those terrorists who are there to be catched and to be interrogated, to get meaningful information who can help us actually fighting against this organization, because we already see that we cannot just negate, as they mentioned to them. They need to be literally wiped out of the earth, and we cannot just accept these people and say like, look, you were one of the leaders, now it's fine because the war is in. No, it doesn't. Look at the Syria. They're coming back and now they're coming to the Europe and they're causing even more harm. They're literally blowing up bombs in the capitals. So these people are so much brainwashed that you cannot just take in consideration just to let it go because you know it's ended. Because they never said it's ends. For them, the end doesn't come. For them, only end is after they prevail. So in this kind of situation, we need to destroy even the basis of their organizations in order this to function. So the moment when they gather the information for these people, because of this ways of torturing them, etc., this is the moment when we're going to get meaningful information who can stop them. But why this is only? I say this is the only way, because those people are so brainwashed, they're not just going to come and just tell them whatever they want. We need to use their own weapons of their own people to gather meaningful information who can give us the intel and insight, who can help us how to fight these organizations who are so deep underground. And we obviously cannot just like take few of them to our side and then say, look, these people are going to tell us and give us everything. Because of this, because of what these people are, because their brainwashed state, they will not cooperate, because as I already told you, and thank them for their question, these people, even when you try to cooperate, they kill their leaders who want to cooperate. So this is not about investigation, this is about quitting them in total, because all of this will begin to oppose.
Alright. So let's talk about Batman for a moment. So Batman is a very horrible crime fighter. Why? Because he cannot use any of the mechanisms that people can use against him and that can use against his people in this sort of situation. He just breeds more people who are willing to do more extreme stuff than he is in order to instill fear, in order to make people more radicalized and actually vote away all the jokers of the Gotham City in this sort of situation. I'm gonna necessarily, on a more serious note, talk about how this necessarily harms, on utilitarian calculus, harms a lot of the Muslims that are actually living in Europe right now, how this leads to much more killing, and how ineffective fighting of these terrorist organizations is getting much more leverage to stuff like Russia, Iran, in this sort of situation. Very interesting case, I'm gonna tell it in this sort of situation. So, but first let's answer the point, of closing opposition. They're leaning towards some negotiations and something like this. Frame. The fact that something is enshrined in law or not enshrined in law doesn't necessarily mean that it's used all the time or that it is not used all the time in this sort of situation. So this means that when you're making a trade-off, if the torture is available and you can use it, you're not giving like, I'm gonna torture every single person in this world, because that has some consequences. And you, as a military operator, as a general, as an expert technocrat, you know what the trade-offs are, which means possible decrease in the negotiations in this sort of situation. Also, it means, radicalization of populace sometimes in this sort of situation. So you are not using this like a crazy madman who is just doing it to do whatever. You have some checks and balances. Other checks and balances on these people are media, Amnesty International. But we're talking about people protesting on the street when some of these happen. On Guantanamo Bay, politics, who can pull away these troops in this situation. We're obviously talking about the West, because Russia does not adhere to these standards anyway, so we are talking about the US and the EU. Sorry, Russia, if there's any Russian in this sort of situation. So we believe that given this framework, their case doesn't stand, because this will be used, especially torture, will be used as a measure of last resort. When we have to get some information, when we have a mission that is failing, when we have a lot of civilian, hostage hostage situation, and then you need to use this sort of situation. And this is what I asked them, is it better to kill people or torture them in this sort of situation? They're like, no, but like, it's different. We blow them up, we have some interventions. They stumbled in this sort of situation. So the point and the fact of the matter is, sometimes we have to do bad stuff in order to save some good people in this situation. We argue that killing of these terrorists are quite as bad as torturing them. And unless they're going to prove to us that we want to save each and every one of these terrorists, capture them and sing kumbaya with them, I think it's pretty symmetrical in this situation, and they haven't engaged with the real comparative. But also notice that this debate is not allowing torture. This debate has two other components, not just two, multiple other components, which are talking about release of prisoners in this situation, which is plaguing Europe and Syria, and this is what I'm going to talk in this situation. So effectiveness on how many levels? First of all, missions were conducted way better. When you know you have a couple of options in order to get your soldiers out, or in order to get, civilian casualties to be the less, you're much more likely to use some of these options when it's necessary and when it's needed. So you should not maybe trade off soldiers when the treaty says so. You should not let them go after you're done fighting ISIS, because that's what they say. And you are forced to defend letting them go, because this is the motion in this sort of situation. So in this sort of situation, we have way less effectiveness of fighting these wars. Deterrence as well. Like, just by terrorists knowing that we cannot touch them and we cannot do anything like that, they fear Russians, but they don't fear us. They don't fear getting captured by the US in this situation, because they know they have a code of conduct that they would have to be adhering to, and they would have to do it. Just by deterrence factor of somebody fearing that somebody might torture you, not necessarily torturing you in the first place, means that some of them might be dissuaded. Not everybody. We're not solving terrorism. Nobody's solving terrorism here. But we will have less of it, and this is the comparative debate, so we win in this sort of situation. Notice that the trade-offs that they have to make also is not just, oh, we have a poor tortured guy, we don't get anything. It's also less effectiveness of fighting terrorism, which is translated into more innocent lives getting lost, more people getting radicalized, less political capital to even go to these interventions and to even fight these people, because you see your soldiers getting captured and not bringing our boys back home or whatever. So why is this debate? So we talked broadly about some interventions in this situation, so let's put some context into it. This debate is about Syria, clearly. They have said it because currently the biggest problem is that Europeans, and after the war, with this treaty, you have to return, you have to let these people go, you have to let European fighters come back in this sort of situation. Maybe prosecute them, probably not because of this treaty in this sort of situation. This is a huge problem. First of all, because of the wave of terrorism that is about possibly to happen. But not even the wave of terrorism happening. Anticipation of wave of terrorism happening is something that is enough for people, first of all, to radicalize and to vote for more right-wing governments and to necessarily then harm other people. So how does that mean? Voting for more radical parties in this sort of situation creates the machine of radicalism, which produces new terrorist attacks and which actually diminishes the minority of Muslims in European Union in this sort of situation. We believe those translate into policy that intake less refugees, that discriminate, like Denmark, like Poland, like Hungary in this sort of situation. We believe that ineffectiveness of fighting these people and actually letting them back to us in 1 second is necessarily making Europe worse for people who are innocent, who are Muslims, who are going to get discriminated against, and who are going to be painted with the same brush as these people, because you cannot differentiate them. And people are stereotypical assholes who see a color and discriminate in this sort of situation. We believe this is a wrong, and this is what we have on our side of the house. Yeah.
So the only justification you get for separating terrorists is because they don't abide by international law. But as you say, Russia doesn't obey international law. So should Ukrainians not obey international law against Russian soldiers?
They aren't obeying it currently. But that on the side, maybe, possibly, yes. Why not? Why? Because if you're fighting an asymmetrical war, when somebody is kicking your ass and ruining the world for everybody of the same skin color, of the same faith, we believe this is a pretty justified thing. On top of the big pile of cake, which says a lot of dead people and less effectiveness of fighting terrorism. Alternatives. So if we're not effectively fighting terrorism, who goes and fights terrorism effectively and does all of these things? These are stuff like Shiite militias. These are stuff like Russia, and these are people who are actually willing to do and cross these boundaries. This is bringing them political capital that they didn't have before. They are being portrayed as savior of the Middle East, of savior of, and fighters of terrorism. This is why Donald Trump is pulling away and being like, oh, it's done, they can do it, they are doing it effectively. Because they're willing to break the rules. And on our side of the house, we are not using it all the time. We can use it sometimes. And our effectiveness at fighting this terrorism and effectiveness of fighting these people actually gives us more leverage to actually intervene properly and to actually do this sort of stuff. Okay, I know this sounds horrible, that they're like, we gotta torture people in this situation, but I think war is horrible, and all of the utilitarian consequences that they have to deal with has to be weighed in this debate. Don't use your preconditions like torture is bad necessarily, while killing is pretty much symmetrical. Please vote, all of you. Thank you.
Are you ready?
In August of 2014, within the space of 3 weeks, ISIS was able to capture a fifth of Syrian territory. In 1999, the Tamil Tigers were able to capture a tenth of Sri Lankan territory within the space of 2 months. It confounds us that for people who are not very well equipped, for people who do not have a lot of firepower, and for people who are generally very organized, very disorganized, can have so much success in terms of these military achievements. We posit that the reason that these terrorist organizations can do this is that in the domestic atmosphere that they thrive in, they create a psychology of terror. We're going to specifically show to you how this policy eliminates that psychology of terror and impedes the terrorist organization's ability to do 3 things. 1, capture these territories. 2, maintain control of these territories. And 3, how it also prevents them from coming back in the aftermath. Before that, I'm going to have some rebuttal towards opening opposition. 2 things. Firstly, what is the purpose of these protections in the first place? I posit that if it's really true that the protection of the purpose of these protections is the protection of human rights, then we can simply prove on our utilitarian calculus that en masse we have protect more human rights. That if you can prevent 70 Yazidi girls from being raped by the torture of one individual, it's truly an unfortunate trade-off, but that's one that we're about to make. Secondly, we think that the main moral duty that you often owe in terms of protective restrictions is to those victims. And the reason that that happens is that rules are only instrumental insofar as they guarantee fair play. This is extremely important. The reason that you have rules in this debate or rules of war is because there is a necessary expectation that both sides will follow it. If the expectation does not exist, then the instrumental value of the rules does not exist anymore. Where is the instrumental value derived from? 3 things. 1, proportionality. It's important for responses to be proportional to the response that has been given to you. Secondly, propensity. That there was a high chance that this terrorist organization or any other actor would harm you in a case in which this policy was not used. And thirdly, necessity. And this is the only policy we have left. We think because that's true, it's important to look at protections in the framework of why they came to exist in the first place. They exist because of the horrors of World War II. We don't want that to happen again. But if organizations are repeating the horrors of World War II, it's important to live with proportionate, necessary, and propensity response towards them. The second idea they had within this was abuse. This policy will be systematically abused by a lot of people. I think opening government has done well insofar as providing accountability mechanisms. I posit that the reason for why this will not happen is because we've had these conventions and norms for 70 years. A lot of opening opposition speech is literally my analysis. We know about Edward Snowden. We know about the NSA leaks. Everyone hates the government now. Everyone hates the CIA. There's a huge anti-FBI campaign. The reason these things are happening is because there's a climate against intelligence services having too much power. So it's not just the media or the Supreme Court. It's literally that the conventions and norms that we follow right now are very, very anti-torture, which means that we will use them only in exceptional circumstances. Their last argument was this, but before that, one last thing. How does torture work? You literally don't just torture anyone. You do a cross-analysis of domestic intelligence. You look at foreign intelligence that you have. You check with your spies. Like the probability of you just literally torturing people, I think, is infinitesimal. I just disagree with the characterization of that argument. The last thing I quickly want to say in terms of rebuttal. This will be used as a propaganda tool. I didn't believe I would have to say this in the debate. ISIS does not hate the West because we torture them. There are several more endemic reasons for why the ISIS hates the West. 1, the ideological differences. 2, they let women do what they want. 3, just like scriptural differences in the Islamic text. Or literally things like that opening opposition mentioned. Poverty, interdimensional poverty, etc., etc. Seizure of territory. I don't think this is going to make a massive difference insofar as propaganda is concerned. They will hate the US anyway. Let's talk about my extension. I posit the main purpose of this debate is to reward the side which most reduces the grip of terrorism. I think we're going to do that in this debate. How are we going to do that? We posit that the most important tool that organizations such as ISIS have is the idea of creating a climate of fear. An investigative journalistic piece within this found that ISIS went to the first village that it raided, enslaved every single woman, killed everyone else. There were literally rivers of blood in the villages, and the next 6 villages completely surrendered.
That's sort of the point, isn't it? It's not literally the amount of harm that they're causing to you really. It's literally the idea that ISIS is an invincible force. It is a narrative of invincibility that buttresses the idea of fear. The reason that I fear someone or something is not only because I believe it's more powerful than me, but also because it has the power to exercise power on me, but I do not reciprocally. What that means is that these are invincible organizations that everyone should fear. How do we eliminate that? Several ways. The point at which you literally know that these invincible gods who are taking over you are crying in torture, the point at which you know that they will never return to their families, is the point at which domestic forces within these areas, be it in Aleppo, be it in northern Sri Lanka, be it in northern Sudan, realize that these aren't just people who we can never tackle anymore, challenge anymore. These are human beings, these are human beings just like us, these are vulnerable human beings who we can crack for intelligence, who we can keep against their will, and whose only solution isn't fight till the death for God's glory. It's literally that you will cry and torture until we tell you what the intelligence is. It humanizes them. And the point at which it humanizes them is when we reduce the invincibility complex that this has. Crucially, this impacts capture. Particularly because, remember, the reason these organizations are so successful is because they form semi-states. ISIS literally taxes its territories. So do the Tamil Tigers, so do Boko Haram, so do ISIS and Al-Qaeda. What that means is it's important to take down the purpose for why that state exists, which is legitimacy. There is a reason that Yazidi women are raped and then pay tax to these people. It's because they fear them so much that the legitimacy for the state exists. That's the premise for a lot of these states. Secondly, it's very important to realize that these captures happen so rapidly. It's important to diminish the utility of these captures. Again, we do this by reducing the climate of fear. Those 6 villages do not surrender because they know these are not gods, these are human beings. How do you disagree?
Yeah, when leaders are killed or tortured, they're not humanized, they're martyrized. They're used as propaganda to become even more powerful and loved by their people.
Yes, but like the Ayatollah isn't a god anymore. He was martyred, but that meant that he could die. It's very important to see this. I just think this is crucially important in this debate. Often enough, you deify these people because you have spiritual leaders within these ranks, etc., etc. Because to be fair, the vast majority of terrorist organizations have a religious element, and within religious elements, you have hierarchies. This is my leader. This is the person who is the messenger of God. This person has a prophetic element attached to him. We think we remove that, the point at which we literally treat them the way you would treat other people. The last thing I want to say about this, and I think it's really important, is that you also reduce the element of the aftermath. What does that mean? The point at which you just randomly release terrorists because of the Geneva Convention, etc., is the point at which these people often return to these areas. These areas are post-conflict areas who have recently recovered from the terrible atrocities of terrorism. They are nascent democratic structures often. They have nascent accountability structures. The point at which you say, no, we are not going to send these people back. We're going to keep them with us, even if it means that it's against the Geneva Convention, specifically because this state will have time to recover. We think it's a victory. We've shown to you that the psychology of fear is what drives these terrible organizations forward. We take that away. We show them that they are as human as we are. We're very proud to propose.
Both government teams tell us that we should do bad things if they achieve good outcomes. That's a stance, that's not an argument. I don't think in any of the 3 speeches we've heard previously, we've gotten any substantiation about why any of the 3 or possibly more tools that they're talking about are concretely and practically related to the alleviation of conflict to any sufficient degree. We're going to debunk that thoroughly in closing opposition, but additionally, we're going to actually talk about why we think this is principally unjustified, even if opening government and, closing government are right on the idea that this is something that is somewhat utile. We're going to say that the principle is more important, but on either regard, we win this debate. Refutation is going to be entirely integrated. Let's start with the principle. I think the first thing to note here is just contextualizing why these rights exist. And the rights do not exist because of some fact of affiliation. They exist because of something intrinsic to every single human being. That is to say, it doesn't matter who you choose to alliance with or for what cause you choose to fight. The fact that you are a human means that you have basic rights that ought not be violated, right? Even if it's the case that you might be somebody violating those rights. But beyond that, we'd also like to say that the idea that terrorist organizations are distinct from states is often flawed, because often in the regions that these terrorist organizations take, from a domestic standpoint, they actually are state-like, because they hold a monopoly on the narrative of what ideology looks like, right? So really, if you think of somebody fighting, for example, for North Korea, there's no principal distinction about the amount that they've been brainwashed or by the amount of which they're fighting for a cause that violates international law. There's no distinction from that basis that we say applies to terrorist organizations that does not apply to a host of other countries throughout history well after the introduction of these international laws. In response to a POI, opening government says, we actually think that you should use this against States too, which is really cool because it shows that they don't actually know how to deal with their burden, rather they like to just expand the debate as big as possible to run away from actually proving any uniqueness. But we'll take them on that too, because we'll say that if you care about like just doing things for utility's sake and for always advantaging the sake, and you don't care about international law in those circumstances too, then I'm not really clear what circumstances they do stand for international law. I think the stance they stand for is the West should just wait for people to initiate violations and respond in proportion, and I don't think that's a good enough stance for them in this debate. Let's talk more about the principle. I think it's important to note here that like the violation of international law actually doesn't necessarily like warrant reciprocation of violation against international law. Again, this is another thing that both government teams say is their stance, but never actually do the legwork to prove why that ought to be the stance you prioritize in this debate. A little too late for you now. I think it's important to recognize that like when it's the case that you violate these laws, you violate something fundamental that we have said that people and actual living people deserve, right? That's to say, we actually think that people deserve to be treated in this way as the bare minimum regardless. And I don't think the fact that they haven't treated you that way is something that is generally a principle we abide by in society. Because if you think about it, it's the exact same reason why we have criminal rights in domestic courts. That is to say, the fact that you violated like a certain amount of law in a society does not mean that we violate your rights, nor does it mean that we apply eye for an eye or proportional justice in a way that hurts you. That's why we don't apply the death penalty for murderers, and it's similarly why we say that you have rights as somebody in a prison. And I think that the exact same principles here apply in international law, right? The fact that you don't abide by law, even the fact that you might evade law, is not exclusive to terrorist organizations compared to criminal courts where we like to say that this principle is intact, right? Also understand that like the breaking of this principle can actually lead to a like the precedent for the troops where they don't actually end up respecting this, right? So I think it's important to note that when you say that this is something that troops can do against populations, it leads to them saying that they can do that in the future, right? These very troops that violated international law, who maybe committed torture, are more likely to do that in the future, even against the wishes of their government, right? Because we already know that troops from the United States do things like war rape in Afghanistan, even though it's not allowed. So I think the fact that we disallow it in a future circumstance is unlikely to make a difference in the fact that they continue to do this. But furthermore, I would say that's important to note that this spills over onto the way that they deal with civilians. One of the main reasons we have international laws on conflict like this is for the protection of civilians, and it's for the protection of spillover forces that might affect civilians. I think the fact that troops might use this as justification in the future to harm civilians is something that is unacceptable, right? Let's talk about proportionality, because this is what the government case hinges itself on. I want to note here that the idea of proportionality vastly glosses over the diversity of people involved in terrorist organizations. Most people in terrorist organizations are neither ideologically motivated, nor are they people that are actually committing crimes on the ground. They're people that were coerced by violence into joining, or people who are coerced by needs such as food, right? The idea that they do anything or are wrong or brainwashed and therefore we must break them is completely wrong. The idea that we can capture somebody who's barely fighting and torture them for the idea that they are somebody that has done something wrong is just not true. That proportionality doesn't exist for most of the population. No thank you. So I think that's also out of the water. But the last thing I want to say here is like, beyond just saying that they commit out of necessity, even within war, there's a principle that we need to minimize the effect on life and the loss of life and the the ceiling on violence. I think this is consistent with that principle. I think that's something we ought to abide by, period. Opening.
Okay, if the principle there is something magical intrinsic among humans that is valuable, would you also bomb and kill them? The same question as all.
Cool, I guess you weren't satisfied about O's answer, so hopefully this puts this dumb question to rest. The idea that we are like bombing them in exclusion to torturing them, like, look, if we're going to conduct a military campaign against them, we're doing this for strategic reasons. The strategic reasons are to accomplish things. I get that you're excited because you're like, our case was strategic reasons. That's how we win this debate. Don't worry, I got a whole other extension. Let's talk about strategic reasons. First of all, Senate report conveniently showed us that torture doesn't actually work for being able to find things like the actual tactical intelligence that you want to get most of the time. Particularly the people that would have the most useful information, the ones that are ideologically motivated, are the hardest to break and the least likely to give useful intelligence. That's just a fact that we know. The reason is because they're so devoted that they're literally not going to be willing, even under violence, to do these things. So I don't think that that ever is something that gets useful there, right? But also note like the idea that we're going to torture people and that's somehow going to like lead to more access to these regions. It's just not necessarily substantiated because it hinges on the unbuilt construction that we're getting intel that's necessarily going to be useful. I think the vast majority of the time we're not actually going to get intel that's remotely useful, and we're going to be doing doing this against people that were easily captured and not necessarily perpetuating the violence as I already discussed. But moreover, I also want you to note that this motion theoretically applies to more than just how we treat prisoners beyond like torture and releasing them. It says any international laws. Like this presumably includes using chemical weapons against terrorist organizations. That's something that's well within the scope of the motion that never gets justified or dealt with by government. But last thing I want to note here is just like, beyond our idea to protect civilians, this actually tangibly worsens our ability to access conflict. It ruins negotiations, as we brought up, right? They get worse, even though they're already bad, as was opening government's only answer. But I also think that it leads to impersonality of like being able to get NGOs to actually enter those spaces. Those people never get to be able to intervene in a way that is helpful. You get way worse radicalization, incredibly bad to oppose.
Our extension, how to weigh up in this debate and why it won. Secondly, we're looking extraneously at the opposition arguments about efficacy, and then lastly, the principle and taking down their specific claims. But let's start with our extension, because it might completely unresponded to you. Hamza starts, the premise of the whole trade-off about utilitarian versus non-utilitarian, should we torture, comes from a conception of where the purpose of international laws come from and what they're used to achieve. Hamza specifically tells you they're constructed, that human rights are a construct which is instrumental to achieving good outcomes and protections. That should therefore be the test of what is the best outcome, what best fulfills the need to protect people and a good outcome. In the vast majority of cases, that is complying with international law. In the cases which it's not, in this specific instance, that's the burden we take on to prove to you why that's good. I think that's a link missing from opening government when they talk about like utilitarian in general. We tell you why specifically that these rules are instrumental to achieving the utilitarian benefits we want to anyway. But what we need to do after that is, once we prove to you the utilitarian calculus, we need to prove to you why specifically this is the best way of getting the most benefits. Hamza is the only person in this debate to explain where terrorist groups actually get their power and control come from. I think OG established that they do establish fear and control through this asymmetry of power, but Hamza tells you specifically why the psychology of fear and legitimacy gives them control, because what matters is being able to control territories so quickly, with disorganization, with a lack of resources. Even when you go into a territory and they just surrender straight away, it's because what matters is the perception of how strong you are, not specifically the force you endure. That's something that might be completely unresponded to. The reason that they're able to be so successful is because they create this fear, but what that feeds into, this is what Hamza said, ignored, is the complex of invincibility. You can't rise against them, you can't do anything because they control everything. They are, beyond you, they don't share your weaknesses. This is something which being able to subject them to the things we talk about, like torture, which will be, we think, publicized and people will find out about a lot, because a lot of the reasons they say is something which is massively important in terms of the signaling effect to empowering victims to say that this, that there is hope and there are ways to take them down. That's incredibly important. I think Hamza talked to you why this is important in terms of capture, in terms of maintaining control, in terms of their ability to return, and there was no response to that. The impact of our case is that domestic fighters or just domestic civilians who live there stop seeing these people as invincible, because it exposes the human cost, it exposes the weaknesses in the people there, which undermines the perception. The impact of that is that it empowers people to not comply or to feel like they're not able to comply. But crucially, the impact of that is just that weakens the massive stronghold which terrorist organizations have by virtue of operating in terror. Terror itself is a psychological concept. When you have one attack, it's not that attack specifically that causes so much harm and trauma. It's the psychological fear that everyone else feels from it, everyone else is paranoid by it and gets terrified by it. That's analysis which Hamza specifically gave you, but why this specific way is the best. Response to this, CEOs say, but they become martyrs, they don't become humanized. Okay, that's true for people in the organization who, even in their best cases, who don't agree with, make hero wishes in. Our cases specifically are people who are having to be subjected to them, feeling like there's no way out. Not people who are going to idolize them and martyr them. They're going to be like, yes, this is good, this is able to happen. That's incredibly important. Then CEOs point out that these institutions organize